So, welcome everybody, welcome to this stream. This is my first time doing a live stream with this kind of content. I've been developing a lot of different games and I made some content on my blog on digitalaero.wordpress.com. This is basically a quick introduction to Unity. I'll be kind of going through the basic elements of how to create a game, and I'm going to spend about an hour now to create a complete game, and from there we'll continue to create more episodes. So in the end we get maybe something like 5 or 10 episodes where we complete a full game and go all the way from A, which we're currently at, and then all the way until we're publishing this game to the store. How many of you guys have been doing any Unity from before? Please let me know in the chat. I'm paying attention to the chat. I'll try to answer as many questions as possible as we progress here. But please let me know. And also if you have any programming skills like C# or you've done any C++ or JavaScript or anything. Just so I know kind of the level I'm gonna keep this tutorial at. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is episode 1. Today I'm going to go through the basics of Unity, and then I'm going to create a simple game. It's gonna be quite high-paced, so please let me know in the chat if you got any questions. I want to go through the basic elements, so I just want to make sure we get through everything. I'm going to be recording this, so you guys can go back and rewatch it later once this episode is over. Yeah, Unity works with voxels, no problem there. I've been making a couple of voxel games myself, actually. I can probably dedicate an episode later on doing voxels if you guys want. Anyway, here we are. I just started Unity by opening up the exe file, and this is kind of the file new project, the project wizard, I might say. And from here, I'm just going to go ahead and create a new project, and I'm going to create a 3D world. So I'm going to highlight this 3D button here, and then in the project name, I'm just going to create something like, let's say, what can this game call? Like, let's see, dish game. Perfect. This is just a project name. We will probably change this after a while. But let's go ahead and create a new project. Clicking to create new project will actually now start creating this project on your file system. And once it's done with that, it will launch Unity inside of this very neat looking editor. It might be a bit overwhelming to see this user interface at first, but I'm going to go through it, so I'm going to make sure that you guys can follow what I'm doing. So the first thing that you usually see is the game world here. This is basically your game, how it looks from any given perspective. You can move around here like in a first-person shooter, just right-click and hold, and then you can use the VAS controllers to move around inside of the world, and use Q and E to move up and down. So this is just like a first-person shooter actually, but you're in your own game world. On the top here, you're having the transformation tools. These are used to move things around inside of the game world. So I can, for example, select this camera here and select this move tool, and I can move it around inside the game world. The next thing you see is the scene hierarchy. This is where all of your game objects are, and I'm going to get back to what a game object is later, but just for now, know that the game objects are the building blocks of your game. We're having 2 game objects in our game this far. It's the camera and a directional light. Then you have the project tree, which is where all your files are located. This could be plugins, it could be scripts and code files, it could be textures, 3D models, music, sound effect, everything you need to create your game. And then on this side here, you're having the inspector, and if I select different game objects, you can see that the inspector changes. So the inspector is just a viewer of the selected game object when it comes to the properties and the components it's built up from. And I mentioned components. Unity is component based, so everything you do in a Unity game is to add game objects. And let's see, I'm getting some feedback that my mouse pointer isn't visible, so let's see if I can fix that real quick. Okay, I guess I found it. Is that better? Yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. So anyways, going back to the inspector, I mentioned that Unity is made from game objects, and you can think of a game object as the simplest thing in your game, and your game is built up from multiple game objects put together. So if I right click on the hierarchy here, I can go to create empty, and I will create a new empty game object. Having this selected in the hierarchy also selects it in the game world. It's just an invisible point in space because it doesn't have any components added to it except for one, the transform element. And the transform element is the basic element in Unity. You can think of this as an atom or an atom, and you can put together a lot of these to build up something that looks cool and something that works the way you want it to work in your game. But know that every single game object needs to have the transform element attached to it. There's no way of removing it, so you can't go wrong there, but just know that every single game object needs a transform, and a transform is really just a position in space, a rotation, and a scale. So I'm going to go ahead and just reset this one to put this thing in Origo. And you can currently see that I'm now selected this and I'm flying around it in my game world. But I want to make something more interesting of this. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename this one to, for example, player. And inside of this game object, I can now add more stuff. So I can right click the player game object and add a cube, for example. You can see that I'm now added a cube to my scene. It's just like any other game object. I can move it around as I want, just like that. And since this is now a child of player, I can move player around, and I'm actually moving the cube too, because the cube is positioned relative to the player. So I'm going to go ahead and create another one. There we go. And I'm just going to show you this. So if I move player now, you can see that I'm moving both of these cubes because they're childs of player. If I would go and right click here and create another one, let's add another, let's add a sphere, for example. And selecting this one, I can use these tools to scale it and rotate. So this is basically the transform elements. So rotate, you can rotate the thing. And scale, you can scale it. So I'm just going to scale it a little rather big, just like that. You can now see that the cubes, the player, are positioned here, and the sphere is rather there. So if I move these around, you can see that the sphere is not moving because I'm moving the player objects. The cubes are being moved because they're positioned as childs to player. So I'm gonna go ahead and just delete these things because I'm gonna starting from scratch. So this is the first episode in this stream, so I'm thinking of creating something that I had in my mind, and then we can move from there. We can completely change the game together. We can make anything you guys want, so please let me know through feedback as we progress. But just to get through the 101s and get everyone up to track with Unity, I'm gonna go ahead and create a typical lander game. I used to play lander games when I was young. You had this spaceship and you had to land on the moon somewhere. And then from the moon, so basically you had this spaceship and you were going to land somewhere on the moon without crashing. You need to touch down like really softly in order to not break your spaceship. So in a lander game, I think that the first thing that we need is to create the spaceship itself, like the player. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the terrain. And once we have the terrain and the player, I will start making the game so we can move the spaceship around, give it some thrust, and maybe even add some flames and explosions and particle engines and so on. That would be fun. And from there, let's just see where this goes. So anyway, here we are in the game world. I'm having an empty game object called player. I'm gonna recreate it just so you guys can follow me. So right click here, and I'm gonna go ahead and create a new empty game object. I'm gonna do a reset just to keep it in the center. I like to work with things from the Origo it's just my own personal preference. So let's see here, player. There we go. And I'm gonna make a really quick 3D model inside of Unity using cubes and primitives. But in reality, if this would be a game at a later stage and we would be happy with the way the game works, you can go ahead and change these simple models into real proper models that 3D artists have made. So I'm gonna right click here and go ahead and add a new cube to it, and this is going to be the body of my object. With this one, I'm gonna go ahead and add some legs to it. So I can select this cube and I can name it, for example, body. And then I'm going to create another one by pressing Ctrl D or duplicate to create one more of the same type. You can see that I'm now having 2 cubes. But these are going to be the legs of this. So I'm gonna move down here. There we go. And I'll do a little bit of scaling. Okay. This is leg number 1. Gonna pull it a bit out there. This is going to be a weird looking spaceship, but just bear with me. And let me know if you have any suggestions. Do you want this to be like a monster, or do you want this to be like a cute little thing, or do you want it to be cool robotish spaceship thing? Let me know. We can change all of this as we progress with our game. Okay, that's one of the legs. I'm just using these transform tools up here. I'm using hotkeys, W for moving, E for rotation, and R for scaling. Great little hotkeys when you're doing transformation building. A little bit shorter. There we go. And I'm gonna have 4 of these legs, so I'm just gonna duplicate this one and move it all the way back. There we go. And then I'm going to duplicate these 2 as well and move it all the way over. To the other side. The next thing that I want to do is to add some legs to this one, like landing feet. Now you can see how the game objects actually work. I can put together a lot of game objects to create the player. So for example, these are the body elements, and then I'm having feet and arms and legs like in a human. You just put everything together. So I'm gonna go ahead and make the landing feet. Make it a little bit flat like that. Perfect. I'm gonna move this one to the opposite side here. Yeah, it's always important to make sure that your game performs well. There's, I'll show you this. I will show you the stats page later when I'm actually running this game. So there we go. And this is just a prototype. So, but it's starting to look like something. I might as well go ahead and add some eyes to this one, so I can go ahead and say 3D object and then sphere, and then I'll move this one forward just like that. Make it look like some kind of insect or something. Let's keep it asymmetrical as well. There we go. Just like that. And let's also go ahead and add a mouth to this one. I'm just duplicating the body here, and then I'm dragging things in. There we go. Okay, let's add some color to this thing, because right now it's just very gray and boring. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a new folder to my project called Materials. You can name this anything you want. I'm gonna go ahead and name it Materials because I'm gonna add a material to this one. So right click inside of the material folder and say Material, and I'm gonna name it, say for example, gray, because I want to have a gray color to it. Let's maybe even do blue. There we go. And the thing with materials is that a material is a surface description. I'm actually describing how the surface this material is attached to is reacting to the sun, how reflective it is, what kind of color it's having, and so on. So if I have this material here, I can select the color to be more like a bluish type of color. Let's create an interesting complex color here. There we go. And you can see a preview down here of how the material looks. And then I can just drag this thing onto my little weird spider looking thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that on all of these. You can also select all of these and then open the materials branch here and just drag this one inside of this to color everything at once. The next thing I want to do is to create some white ice. So let's see, white. And I'm going to set the color to white. And then I'm going to drag this one all the way over. There we go. And I want the mouth to be black. So let's create another material called black. And I'm using Control D to duplicate this. So there we go. Should we make this guy smile, or should we keep him as it is, or should he be more like angry or sad? We could do anything. You're the game designers here, so you can choose. Let's see. There we go. It's now looking rather weird, but that's okay. The next thing that I want to do is to add some scenery here. I want to have it is a bug. Okay, that's true. Let's go ahead and add some black eyes there. Is that better? You happy? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and add some terrain here. So if I right click here and I say 3D object and go to terrain, Unity will then add a huge white plane in my game world. But this one is actually rather cool. I'm going to show you why. I'm just going to position this one like, let's see here, all the way back there. And I'm going to move it a bit forward. There we go. And then I'm going to select this game object here, and you can see that it got these components to it. And as I said, Unity is component based, so you can just keep on adding components to a game object to make it look like the way you want. So if I go to the terrain component here, you can see that there's this terrain editing tools, and that gives me a little brush. So I can set the opacity of this brush and the size, and I can select what kind of brush I want to have. Like you can see it's very hard, well this one is very soft in the edge. I'm going to go with the softer one, and I'm going to start drawing some mountains in the background here. And going further, I will probably change this landscape into a custom landscape that's procedurally generated, so you can get different landscapes every single time you play your game. I'm gonna set this size up a little bit and some more opacity to make it stronger. There we go. And I'm gonna go and create some more mountain looking things by selecting a brush that's more interesting. It got more some noise to it and so on, just to make it a bit more scary. Then I can go back to this brush and start raising these things into something that looks like spiky mountains. We're an insect, right? So we gotta make the landscape a bit scary. And I'm thinking the landscape is quite boring, it's white, so we need to go ahead and add some textures to this. So if I go to my assets here, I can say create folder, and I'm going to call it textures. And I actually prepared one texture. I made this one in Paint. I'm going to show you how it looks. You can see that it's some sand looking thing with some squares on it. And this will be changed as we make better graphics in our game. But for now, let's just add this one to our project. One neat function in Unity is that you can right click on a folder and say show in Explorer to view that folder in Explorer, and then you can just paste this texture in it and it will be added to my game. So to add this texture to my scene here, I can go to the painting tool and I can select edit textures, add texture, and then select sand texture and add. There we go, and you can now see that our landscape is looking more like a desert. I want to change the look on my mountains a little bit. I still want them to have the sand texture, but I want them to be more rough. So if I go to edit textures and then I add a new one and hit select and add the same texture, but when it comes to the size, I will change the size into, for example, 5.5. And then I can select this texture and start drawing on top of the mountain areas. You can see that it's now much smaller than the other sand texture. I can also do that here just to kind of break the perfect repetitive pattern on the ground. In the game world, or in a game development world or graphics world, there's a saying that says something like imperfection creates perfection. You don't want things to be perfectly repetitive, everything needs to be perfect, everything needs to be perfectly aligned, because in the real world nothing is perfectly aligned. Let's move our player up a little bit. There we go. You can see this nice shadow down there. We're basically flying. You can put this a little bit higher up. Okay. Actually, since I want to add some wings to this one later. It needs some wings. Maybe even some animations. Okay, so anyway, I'm now back into my scene here. I'm having my player in front of me and I'm having a terrain. Let's call it landscape. And then this directional light, I'm going to go through all the default components. Directional light is just a light that's always inside of your scene. If you rotate this light, you can see that I'm rotating the light of my entire game world here. And you can also change the intensity of this light so it's not that bright. And you can change the color. Say for example I want to have red color, or if it's sunset you might want to have it more like this, right? And everything will change based on that light. The thing with the directional light is also that you see that it got a direction. That's the direction the light is now pointing, where the light is coming from. And I usually like to think of this as a sunlight, because no matter how far away you are from this light, you will still get the same amount of light. If this would be a candle light, obviously the closer you are to the candle, the more illumination you would get on the surface. But with this light, it doesn't really matter. Everything is having the same amount of light, no matter where in the game world it is. Okay, so going back to my player here, I want to do a couple of things with this. The first thing I want to do is to make sure that it's affected by a physics engine in Unity, so it falls down. Then I won't be able to control this one. So if I add a component to the player here, let's see, rigid body. This is now a physics object. If I hit play now, let's move the camera a little bit too. this is the camera, and you can see that it got a camera component to it, indicating that this is the game object that will operate as a camera. And this camera component is built into Unity, so you can have multiple cameras in a scene if you want that. I'm gonna move the I'm getting some funny messages on my chat. Okay, so I want to move this camera, and you can see that there's a camera preview here, so I can actually see where this camera is seeing when I'm moving it around in my game world. So I want to move this camera a bit closer to my player. There we go. And if I hit play now, this play button will change the view mode from scene to game, which is actually what the game looks like when you hit play. So if I hit play now, the game will now start and be playing the way it should. As you can see, it's now falling down. But I want to make the camera following this thing. And with Unity, there's something called a smooth follow script. I add this script to my game as well. It came with Unity 4, and I still like to use it, but this is something that's built in with Unity, or it comes with the standard assets. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder here called scripts. And paste it. Yeah, I need to open it in Explorer. And then paste it in there. And now that I have this script here, Unity will compile itself and make sure that this class is now a part of my game. You don't need to worry about this yet. I'll show you how this works later, but for now, just know that I added a custom script that's part of the standard assets with Unity, and I can just drag this script onto main camera. There you go. And you can see that I've now added the smooth follow script here. And once this script is added as a component here, everything I do with this script will now be applicable to this camera. Yeah, I'm having some issues with my display driver. Let's hope it still works. If not, yeah, I will need to do a really quick. Let me save this project, and let's call this scene a main scene. Is everything working on the stream? Looks like that. Yeah, perfect. Where were we? Yes, we were adding this component. This is a custom component. We're adding this one to the camera object. And the thing with this custom component, you don't need to understand how it works. It's just there. You just need to understand how to operate it. So the first thing that this needs is a target, which can be any game object that contains a transform object. And as I said, transform is mandatory on every single game object. So if I drag, for example, my player onto the target here, you can see that it now targets my player, since that's a game object with a transform element to it, or a component. Then you can set the distance from the player, the height, and how smooth it should be. So if I click play now, you can see the camera is now following my little insect, and he falls down. There's two things. The first thing is that you're not able to control this yet, so we will add a new component that fixes that. But before that, I want to change the gravity, because we're not on Earth, and the gravity on Earth is 9.11. Let's see here. I meant, let's see, 81. I think project settings, and then you can go to physics. You can see 981 there. And let's change this one to, for example, 41. Just so the gravity won't pull us that hard. If I play now, you can see that it's now slowly falling down and then in the end crashing. Much more space looking, right? Okay, going back here. Yeah, I should probably disable the auto light baking. Okay, let's see. In my scripts folder, I want to add a new script, because right now I want to be adding the component that lets me control how my player works. Some components are built in. There's a first-person shooter controller following with Unity, as well as a third-person shooter, and a lot of different cameras, but we want to create our own custom camera, because there's nothing that works exactly the way I want. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a new script here, and you can select C# or JavaScript depending on what kind of language you want to be programming with. If you're a JavaScript developer, go ahead and select JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead with C#, and then I'm going to name this player control, or let's see, player handler, because I want to be doing more than just controlling the player in this script. This script will keep track of my scores, if it's game over, some user interface settings, and so on. Once that this script is now added to my project, I can just drag this one onto my player, or you can select add components here and say player, and you can see your own script there. But we already added it, and I'm gonna double click this one to fire up this in Visual Studio. And Visual Studio is basically the tool I use for developing Unity games. This is where I write all the code. And if you download the latest versions of Unity, Visual Studio comes with it as a download, so this should be really easy to set up. And once this is loaded up, it's now creating a Visual Studio project, and it's creating a lot of different things in the background for this project. So I'm getting something called IntelliSense. I'm gonna get back to what that is pretty soon. But right now I'm having Visual Studio up and running, and as you can see, it's a very short script. I know that if you don't know any development or programming or C# or C++, this might look a little bit scary, but I'll go through this, so don't worry. And to put it simple, the first thing that you see here is things that just needs to be there for this script to operate with Unity. This is the name of the script, the player handler, and it automatically created a class that's usable inside of my game. But everything that's important for my script is happening between this start here, put it this way, and the end here. So this is basically my script, and it contains two functions. Everything inside of this function is happening when my game is starting, or when my game object is added to the game world. And this one is happening every single frame. So in update, you will do all of your calculations, input handling, everything that needs to be checked every single frame. While in this one, I only want to set a couple of values for when the game object is born and added to the game world, which is usually happening if I just hit play in this case. So the first thing that I want to do is to just check for some keyboard input. So inside of the update function, I want for every single frame in my game, check if something is happening on my keyboard. So there's this function called, or a class called input. I can say input.get key, and then I can select what key I'm looking for, and I'm looking for, say, A. This is the A is the same as left on the keyboard. I can also go ahead and check the left button as well. So if you're pressing A, or for example left arrow, then I can use the VAST controllers or my arrow keys, which is what I want. So if the player is pressing A on the keyboard, then I want us to rotate. So since this script is now added to a game object which got a transform element to it, I can go back into my script here and say transform dot rotate. Then I want to go ahead and set what axis I want to rotate around, and I want to rotate around the z-axis, which is pointing down into my scene. If you think of, let's see, if you think of this as my player, I want to rotate it with the z-axis that's pointing towards your camera, which means that I'm rotating the player around that. If I would be rotating it against the y-axis, it would be rotating like this, or the x-axis, it would be rotating like this. But I want to have this kind of rotation, because that's how our game works. It's a side-scrolling game. So let's go ahead and rotate this on the z-axis, which is forward. Forward is, as you can see, shorthand for writing vector 3 0 0 1. So I want to do that. Then I want to multiply the rotation speed with a new variable here. I'm going to call it float speed. Let's set the speed to, for example, 5. And I want to multiply that rotation with that speed so it rotates faster. So if I hit save now and go back to my game, I can hit play. It's now falling down, but I can still rotate. It's quite fast, but it does rotate. Okay. So going back to my script, I want to do the same for the other way. And let's call it D, and also the right arrow. And I can multiply this with -1 to invert it, or you can say back here, which is the same as writing 0 0 -1 on the rotation axis. But there's one issue here, and the problem with this is that update is called every frame, and if I would be running this one on a fast computer like my Alienware here, this function or this rotation will happen a lot faster than on a mobile device. And since this game will be working on mobile devices as well as a Windows Store app and everything, I need this to be time dependent. It's very easy in Unity. It got a function for this. It's called time.deltaTime. This is basically time in seconds, a float time in seconds since my last frame. So if a frame takes a long time to render, this value will be big, and if the frame is short on a strong computer, this value will be small, making this all synchronized with the clock. So if I go back to my game world now, it's going to be way slower because the delta time is very slow, but we can rotate that. We can modify that, I mean, sorry. Yeah, so the speed is slower. What I want to do is to go ahead and set this to public now. And what public does with Unity is that if I save this script now and I go back to my game world, you can see if I go to my player, you can see that speed is now set inside of Unity. So instead of going to the script every single time I want to change the speed of my rotation, I can go and set this one to 10. Okay, you can see rotation is much better, but I still want to have it twice as fast, so let's set this one to 20. Alright, let's go in and add one more thing here, because right now it's falling down. I want to add some thrust to it. I want this one to start flying, and to do that I want to move this one upwards, but I want to use the physics engine for this. So instead of just forcing the character to go up every time I press W or the up key, arrow key, I want to add thrust to it, and by adding some forces inside of the physics engine. So if I go back to my script here, I can say input dot get button, no, the get key. Then I want to set the key code to, for example, let's just space for now. If you set space, If you press space, we're firing up the engines in our little insect spaceship. So, okay. So instead of saying transform the position and then move the position, I want to add some force to it. To do that, I need to get a reference to my little physics engine, the rigid body element. So if I go to my player here, you can see that it's having a rigid body, and I can reference this rigid body to alter the physics or the forces to it. So to do that, I can, for example, say that rigid body, and let's call it just RB equals, and then I can call a function called getComponent, and this function just goes into the current object I'm working with, and it's looking for the first rigid body element it can find. And this player object, it got 3 components. It's transform, rigid body, and player handler. So it finds the rigid body, so I can now work with that rigid body element. So I can say RB dot, and then I can say add force. And let's see, we want the force to point upwards relative to my player. So if I rotate it, I want to go upwards, but in the direction that we rotate it to. So I can't say transform.up here, but I can, oh, I meant vector.up, but I can say transform.up. So transform up. And then I want to add another variable here called thrust. And let's say, let's split this to 20. I don't know how much it should be, but we can try. There we go. Then there's a few settings here, I believe. Force mode, then you can say acceleration, because we want to accelerate. You can say impulse, this is more like an explosion, and velocity change the velocity, but we're doing acceleration here. So I'm gonna go back to my game now. And wait for it to recompile. There we go. You can see that I'm now having thrust of 20. Let's see how that works. Yeah, I'm now able to move up. Let's rotate and see if we can go sideways. Yeah, seems like it's working. Perfect. So, in order to make the thrust engine a lot cooler, I can go ahead and add a script, a particle engine to this spaceship. So if I right click on this one and I say, let's go into particle system here, create particle system. I'm not creating a particle system here. Now if I select this one, there's a lot of different settings you can do on the system here. One of them is the shape. I want to do a cone, but I also want to rotate this one down because I want this to look like the flames from some kind of engine. So let's move it a little bit down. There we go, and we can change the shape of the cone as well to something more realistic. Okay. And I also want to add some more emissions to this, so I want the rate to be like 30, just to see how it looks like while I'm currently editing this thing. So let's see here. The next thing that I want to do is to change the color, so it looks like something like a flame. So I'm going to select color over lifetime, and I'm going to select this one. And I'm gonna set this to like something orange, red orange. Then I'm gonna move this one into more of a yellow kind of looking flame. There we go. And I also want to make it more transparent. Okay, and I want the life of each particle to be at around 1 second, and speed is good. Okay, The next thing I want to do is to make sure that this one is not playing on awake, and I want it to be simulated in world space. I'm gonna show you the differences here in a minute. But now I'm in world space, and I'm gonna go into my player handler, and I'm gonna create a new public variable. Public, and it was particle system, I think. There we go. And if we're pressing space, I want to emit, say for example, 5 particles every single time, every single frame that space is being held in. I want to emit 5 particles from this particle engine. But this one hasn't been set yet. I need to go back to Unity to set that particle engine to reference this one. So there we have, it's now recompiled, and I can drag this particle engine on top of this one here, and then I'm gonna hit play. You can see that we're now having a pretty decent looking jet system, or thrust or rocket engine, or whatever you can call it. But I think that the force, this thrust force, is quite big, so I'm gonna set this one down to around, let's see, so the gravity was 141, so I'm gonna set the thrust to 4, so we can fight the gravity and also move against gravity. That's better. Okay, there's one more thing I wanted to show, that I can do that real time. If I set this one to local, you can see that the particles are positioned locally on the rotation of its parent, which is our player. But we want to have this one in world, just to make it added to the real world instead. And one more thing, I want to make the particles collidable with the ground. So if I go into my particles here, I can say collision, and it should collide with the world. And every time it collides, it will lose some energy. Right now it's going to be bouncing and maintain all the energy it got. But I want to multiply this by, say for example, 1.15, which is 15%. So if the particle is colliding with something, it will lose 85% of its energy. There you can see. Okay. So I'm going to right click here, and I want to create a platform. Let's call it. Let's add it. Let's keep it simple. It's going to be a cube, and I'm going to say it. Call it the landing platform. And let's reset the position, and then resize. There you go, and this is basically where we want to try to land our spaceship. And when I change the landscapes to be more procedural, I want to randomly place this different places, so every single time you play this game, it's going to be random. So there we have the landing platform. Then I want to add a simple user interface. I'm going to go ahead and create a new UI. Just right click UI, and let's add a text element. If I go to game now, you can see how it actually looks. So I want to move this text all the way up to the top left corner of my screen. So I'm going to select the position to top left, and then set the margins to 0, 0. If I go into Scenu, if I click F, it will focus on the thing that I'm working on. Then I can manually set the margin so it looks nice. Okay, I want the size of this to be around, let's say, 72. and the width needs to be bigger, and same with height. Let's change the margin. There we go. Okay. Let's call this, say, vertical speed, for example. Inside of my script now, I can go to the top of the script, and I need to reference something called unityengine.ui, which gives me all the functions for handling user interface within the script in Unity. Having that reference, I can now say public text vertical speed text, for example. And then I can go into update, and I can say that dot text equals for example vertical speed. Then when you get the speed I'm having in the y direction, so vertically, so I can take the rigid body and then say velocity dot y, and then I can format this to say something simple. I don't need to have all of the decimals. If I wouldn't do that, I would get a lot of different decimals, like 7 decimals in the speed. I only need to have a few. So let's go ahead and drag the text onto the vertical speed variable inside of a player and hit play. You can see I'm falling down. And let's say this is meters per second. Okay. Let's try to see if we can land here. Perfect. Okay. I want to show a very simple way to create a game object or a game over screen. So I can say game over equals false. And then inside of the update, if it's game over, I don't want to be doing any of this stuff. So I can say if game over, or if not game over, then it should check for input. So what I just did is that I'm setting game over to false, and if game over is false, I'm going to go ahead and continue taking input. But if it's game over, then I'm going to change how everything works. Actually, I can set the vertical speed here to inside of this one. Then if it's game over, then I can set the text to game over. Okay. Now we just need to write the rule that decides if the game is over, and I think that the way to set a game over is, let's see here, if we're crashing too hard on the ground. So I can go ahead and add a function here called let's just go and check if this works. So if I'm colliding with something, I want to just print out on the screen the force I'm colliding with. So debug.log, Then I can say other dot relative velocity dot magnitude. This is basically the force I'm colliding with the other element with. So let's just go ahead and play the game and see if something happens. Pay attention down here as I'm falling down. There we go. I collided with the ground on an initial impact of 7.8. So let's say that if you're able to land this thing with an impact less than, say, 1, then it's a safe landing. So if this one is less than 1, then all is good. But I'm actually going to set game over. So if it's higher than 1, I'm going to set game over to true. Let's try this. Waiting for it to recompile. It takes a while sometimes, especially when I'm doing the streaming as well. Just pay attention down here to when I'm landing. Okay, it was too hard, right? It was 1.21. So I need to land even softer. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to do is to just make these the landing platform your destination. And if you're landing on the ground here, I'm thinking that you should be able to land on the ground, but you need to land a lot softer than what you need to do on a platform. So if I go back to my landscape here, I can add a tag to it. You can see there's tag. This is the last thing that I'm going to add today, so I know that it's been a lot, but let's call this landscape. And then let's add another one called platform. Okay, so if I go to my landscape again, I need to set the tag to landscape and this one to platform. So then I can check in the collision that, okay, what tag am I colliding with? Now I need to get the game object because we're colliding with a game object, and then I can check the tag of that game object because tag is an element of game object. So going back to my game world, I'm now falling down. I'm crashing with the landscape. That's how simple it is to change what or know what you're colliding with. So in my script now, I can actually say that if the tag I'm colliding with is landscape, else if and let's copy the game over thing into the platform and the landscape. So in landscape, I want this to be 1 because it's quite hard to land with an impact of 1. But on the platform, what did I call it? Was it landing platform? Platform. Okay. So now I can go back to my game. Let's try to see if we can land on that platform. I will upload the source code to GitHub after this episode, so you can just download it and modify it. And if you want, you can just go ahead and make changes to it as well. I'm going to make it open source. So if you got some cool stuff, yeah, you see, I landed on the platform, but the impact was less than 2, so I'm able to continue flying. Let's try to see if I can get the impact to be a bit higher, so we can get that game over screen running. there we have, game over. I'm trying to control it, but my engines has exploded, so there's no way. Okay, that's it for today's episode. In the next episode, I'm going to continue in this game. I want to add some wings to it and maybe even some animations, some suspensions here. So if I'm landing, you can see that the legs are actually like going down like this. So we are having some proper physics on the legs. And then I want to probably add a character selector so you can unlock new characters, and maybe even add some fuel, so you need to go around and gather fuel tanks in the air to get some fuel for landing. And if you run out of fuel, you know, you won't be able to use your engines, and that will probably result in a crash. And I don't know, come with suggestions. Do you want us to create like a level editor so we can create our own levels? Do we want to add something random, so every time you play the game the scenery is random? So should we use like really cool Berlin noise things? Yeah, okay, I will do it. I will change the material. I was thinking, should I do it or not, but let's go ahead and add some metallic things to my eyes here, so they're getting really reflective. You can see proper reflective. It actually looks like some kind of fly. Right? It's a start though. It's been 1 hour. There's a lot you can do in Unity in 1 hour. Like, we just created a prototype for a game. If you want to play this on a mobile device, all I need to do is to go to build settings here and then add current to add the current scene I'm working with. And then I can select, for example, Windows Store and Universal 10. With Universal 10, it will actually run on all Windows 10 mobile phones, as well as tablets running Windows 10, and even the desktop. And right now it's only working with the keyboard, but it's very easy to add touch input, and I'm going to cover that in a later episode too. Thanks again.